everyone, welcome back to my channel. Now last time when I was explaining the different plots that writers draw on, the winning plots that sell and have sold over time and been made into films and multi-million pound books, we looked at Christopher Booker's plot number 1, which was Overcoming the Monster. Today we're going to be looking at plot number 2, according to Christopher Booker and his 7 basic plots. Now remember, if you want to keep up to date with all of these videos, you need to subscribe, so hit that subscribe button. And any books or references that I make will be cited in the link below. So, today's plot number 2, according to Christopher Booker, is what he calls rags to riches. Now, as the term suggests, it's about a main character, a protagonist, who at the beginning of the story is seen at a low point, either because of financial worries or status. So an example would be somebody like Cinderella, who at the beginning of the plot is forced to take care of the cleaning within the family home. She has 2 horrible stepsisters who prevent her from attending a ball being put on by the wonderful prince. It is only because the fairy godmother appears that she is then enabled to go to the ball. She dances with the prince, she leaves her shoe, and he then seeks her out. As a result of him seeking her out, they end up getting married and she lives happily ever after. She becomes his wife, the princess. She rises during the course of the story from her rags at the beginning to the riches at the end. Now this is a traditional story that falls under the rags to riches plot. Unlike some of the more modern rags to riches plots, Cinderella is actually enabled to move from rags to riches not because of her own actions, but because of those of others. And in this case, it is the fairy godmother and the prince who enable her to rise from rags to riches. But a plot which is more modern and that shows a character rising because of his or her own actions is in the film The Pursuit of Happiness. Now you may have seen this film. It came out a number of years ago and it has that very famous actor Will Smith who plays the main character. Now remember, Will Smith, he rose to fame, didn't he, because of The Prince of Bel-Air. And in this film he plays the character of a down on his luck salesman who is trying to sell medical equipment at the beginning of the plot. He's not succeeding, unfortunately, and during the course of the plot he loses his wife, he loses his home, and he is left with his child and essentially doesn't have much of a job. So he's very much down on his luck and he's shown at the rags stage. However, during the course of the plot, even though at times it appears hopeless for him, he manages to succeed through his own determination because he learns to stock trade. And by the end of the plot, he is a very successful stockbroker. And he rises from rags to riches. So that's a very tangible example of rags to riches, and it's lovely that it's based in fact. And he does this through his own actions, unlike Cinderella. The final example I'm going to give you is taken from, again, a well-known story, that of Superman. In this story we have Clark Kent, who is an everyday journalist and a normal person. But during the course of the Superman stories, he becomes this superhero who rises from rags to riches. So the rags to riches plots are versatile plots that work around the idea of moving from some kind of impoverishment, if it is financial or in terms of status or just general characteristics, and they move to a higher status. The characters move from that state to a higher status during the course of the novel or the screenplay or whatever the case may be. And these sorts of plots are very successful and have been used over time. The reason they're successful, if you think about it, is because readers and audiences like to see people being successful. It gives them a sense of hope that their lives can get better if they're in a state where they're not. So these are hopeful stories that sell and that have winning plots. Rags to Riches plot that we just covered falls into the same number of stages as the previous plot that we discussed, which was overcoming the monster. Christopher Booker divides this plot into 5 separate points. So let's look at those 5 points now. So the structure of the Rags to Riches plots are similar to the Overcoming the Monsters plots in that they are made up of, according to Christopher Booker, 5 distinct stages. The first stage is what he calls the initial wretchedness at home and the core. This is where we see the hero in his humble surroundings. We see where the hero is going to move from. So if you think of the plot of Cinderella, we see her at home cleaning, and we see her with her wicked stepsisters. And if you think about The Pursuit of Happiness, we see the character played by Will Smith, Chris Gardner, at his home surroundings, trying to make a living selling those bone density machines and struggling financially, and in a situation where with his wife where he needs really to sell the machines or the marriage may break down. So that is the initial wretchedness at home and the call. The call is the prompt to action, the need to move from that state of wretchedness. And as we have just discussed, we see that the marriage is in jeopardy and finances are at a low point for Christopher Gardner, so that he must do something in order to survive. Out into the world and initial success is what Christopher Booker calls the second stage in the Rags to Riches plot. So at this stage, the hero has some minor struggles, but it looks like he or she could succeed. So if you think about the Cinderella plot, it's when Cinderella meets her prince and she and he get along well. But at this stage, Christopher Booker says the hero hasn't matured fully, so any victories are short-lived. And if you think about the plot of The Pursuit of Happiness, we have Christopher Gardner who meets the manager from Dean Witters called Jay Twistle and impresses him in a cab ride by solving a Rubik's Cube. This is an initial success, but after this he faces a number of difficulties, including difficulties relating to rent, having to paint his apartment in order to appease his landlord, then being put in jail. So this initial success is short-lived, and it is the hero is not yet at a stage where he is fully successful. So then we move on to what Christopher Booker calls stage 3, what he calls the central crisis. So similar to what you might find in the traditional story arc, we have the movement towards what is the climax, the moment when the hero faces a point of what might be classed as no return, because whatever he or she is facing is so great. The small victories that he or she has had previous to this time are slowly being stripped away. So in the case of the story of Christopher Gardner and The Pursuit of Happiness, he is faced with some outstanding parking tickets, which he then has to go to jail for. Consequently, he is almost late and turns up to his interview with the prestigious company Dean Witters, looking rather dishevelled because he had been painting before he was taken off to jail. This is a moment of crises, but it's not the main crisis point. The main crisis point comes when he is actually evicted and his wife leaves him. So that is the climax of the plot, and that is where we see what Christopher Booker terms the central crisis. So the point when Christopher Gardner is homeless, essentially, almost jobless, and without a wife and left to tend to his son's needs. We then move on to stage 4 in the plot structure of the Rags to Riches, and that is what Christopher Booker calls the independence and the final ordeal. So at this stage, according to Christopher Booker, there's no more genies or fairy godmothers, and the protagonist has to rely on his or her own skills to back himself or herself up. And at this point we see Christopher Gardner in the plot of The Pursuit of Happiness, struggling and through his own determination trying to succeed and to continue with his internship, despite the fact that he has no home and is having to sleep at points in train station toilets. I don't know whether you have seen the film, but there's a very emotional point where he is having to sleep in a toilet with his son because he has no money. At the same time, he's getting up, taking his son to daycare and going to his internship at the prestigious stockbroker's firm. So this is really him at that stage 4 where he is independent, and it's the final ordeal because it is breakpoint for him. He must succeed in order to survive. So we see him really struggling on his own, learning a lot of information. He's left to his own devices. At this stage also we see that he manages to locate one of the bone density machines that he had lost previously, and he manages to sell it. If we think about the story plot of Cinderella, although Christopher Booker references the fact that at this stage there will be no fairy godmothers and it's left to the protagonist's own strength to pull him or herself up, yes, the fairy godmother is not present at this stage in the plot of Cinderella, but it is the prince who comes and helps Cinderella out of her position, her low position, by offering her marriage. We then move on to what Christopher Booker calls stage 5, the final union, completion and fulfillment. So at this stage we have Cinderella marrying her prince. And in the case of The Pursuit of Happiness, we have Christopher Gardner being offered a full-time position in the stockbrokers Dean Witters. So we can see that according to Christopher Booker, we have 5 stages in the plot structure for Rags to Riches. The first stage is what he calls initial wretchedness at home and the call. The second stage is out into the world and the initial success. The third stage is the central crisis. The fourth is independence and the final ordeal, before we have stage 5, the final union, completion and fulfillment. If we now turn briefly to Syd Field's story paradigm, we can see where we might place these particular points within the story arc that he has constructed. So, the first 2 stages, according to Christopher Booker, the initial wretchedness and the call, and then out into the world and initial success, we could place in Act 1 in the inciting incident and plot point 1. The next stage in the plot, the central crisis, if we were to look at Syd Field's story paradigm, we would be looking to place that in the confrontation stage at the climax point. And then if we move to the next stage, according to Christopher Booker, for the Rags to Riches plot, the independence and the final ordeal, that would fall into Syd Field's resolution in his Act 3, because during that time loose ends are being tied up, so we have the plot moving towards its end. The next stage, which is the final union, completion, fulfillment, is at the end of the story in what traditionally is known as the denouement. So you can see the way in which the 5-stage structure for Rags to Riches can be placed within Syd Field's story paradigm or any traditional story arc. So now we have covered the 5-stage structure found in the Rags to Riches plot, and we've also looked at 3 examples from stories and films that fall into this Rags to Riches, some more closely than others. So The Pursuit of Happiness is probably the closest example that I provided you of Rags to Riches, as is Superman, and then we have of course Cinderella, which is in most ways, except in the fact that she's not driving her own success. You've also found out about the different stages within the story plot, those 5 stages that we outlined. The initial wretchedness and the core, the out into the world and the initial success, central crisis, the final ordeal and independence, and then the completion, the fulfillment, and the final moments of the plot. So you should have a clear idea about the Rags to Riches plot, which is a successful plot that has been used by winning writers who have sold films and books. And hopefully this is a plot that you can use yourself. And if you have examples of how this plot appears in other films or books, then drop me a comment. We'll be moving on next time to plot number 3 according to Christopher Booker in his 7 basic plots. So make sure that you hit that subscribe button so you don't lose out on seeing that particular video. Also, if you're interested in tips on writing, teaching and leadership in general, then make sure you subscribe. I look forward to seeing you next time.